Have you ever looked at your bank account and wondered why you don't save more for retirement, even when you absolutely know you should? Well, we're going to dive into how the field of behavioral economics gives us some really practical answers to questions just like that. We'll be looking at some fascinating research from economist Raj Chetty to see how these ideas are actually shaping real-world policy. I mean, it's a feeling we all know, right? You make these grand plans to save money, eat healthier, finally tackle that huge project, and then, well, life gets in the way. That gap, the one between what we want to do and what we actually end up doing, that is one of the biggest puzzles in all of economics. And this is where a more pragmatic perspective comes in. The whole point of behavioral economics isn't to just throw out the old traditional economic models, not at all. It's about making them better, adding some practical, psychologically savvy tools to the policymaker's toolkit. So here's the classic side-by-side. On one hand, traditional economics kind of pictures us as these perfectly rational supercomputers, always calculating the absolute best choice. But behavioral economics, it gives us a much more realistic picture. We have biases, we get decision fatigue, and we rely on mental shortcuts to get through the day. In short, how a choice is presented to us can matter a whole lot more than the choice itself. So, according to Chetty's work, this more realistic view makes three massive contributions to public policy. First, it gives us brand new tools to help change behavior. Second, it helps us make way better predictions about the policies we already have. And third, it lets us ask these deeper questions about what actually makes people's lives better. So let's look at one example for each of these. All right, first step, new tools. And we're tackling a big one, the savings puzzle. Seriously, how do you actually get people to save more for their retirement? Well, the traditional answer has always been financial incentives. For decades, the go-to tool has been tax subsidies. In the US alone, the government spends over $100 billion a year trying to encourage us to save in accounts like 401ks. The logic seems simple, right? Make it cheaper to save, and people will save more. But here's the thing. Does it actually work? A massive study using data from every single person in Denmark found a pretty shocking result. For every dollar the government spent on these tax breaks, total savings went up by only about 1 cent. 1 cent. The standard tool, it just wasn't cutting it. This quote from Chetty really gets to the heart of why. What the data shows is that something like 80% of us are what he calls passive savers. We're not sitting there with spreadsheets optimizing our savings based on complex tax codes. Nope, we're mostly just sticking with whatever the default is, the status quo. So what does work? This chart is so revealing. It shows the power of a simple behavioral nudge, automatic enrollment. Take a look at the green line. That's when an employer automatically bumps up their contribution to an employee's pension. Now look at the red line. That's the employee's own contribution. It barely moves. People don't cut back on their own saving to make up for it. The result is a huge jump in total savings. It proves that just changing the default setting is way, way more powerful than a massive tax subsidy program. Okay, next up, let's see how these behavioral insights help us make better predictions. We're going to use the example of the Earned Income Tax Credit, or the EITC. It's a major U.S. policy designed to help out low-income workers. So on the left here, you can see how the EITC works. The credit maxes out at a specific income level, creating that kink in the graph. Logically, you'd think people would try to earn an income right at that peak to get the most money. But the chart on the right, it shows a puzzle. In Texas, you see this huge spike, what they call bunching, of people reporting incomes right at that sweet spot. But in Kansas, the effect is way smaller, even though their credit is actually more generous. Traditional economics has a really hard time explaining that. So to solve this puzzle, researchers basically mapped out this bunching behavior across the whole country. And this map from 1996 shows that right after the EITC got a big expansion, the knowledge of how to maximize it was really only concentrated in a few places, like southern Texas and around New York City. Okay, now watch what happens by 2005. Those darker red areas showing more of this bunching, they've spread all over the map. And this reveals the key insight. Knowledge about the tax code isn't something everyone gets instantly. It spreads through social networks. People learn from their friends, their family, their tax preparers. This behavioral factor is the missing piece of the puzzle. And that brings us to the really crucial takeaway here. Once you account for how information spreads, you can make much, much better predictions. In places with high knowledge of the EITC, that's the red triangles, you see a much bigger group of people earning wages right in that optimal zone. This lets us see the true impact of the policy. And it turns out it's actually pretty darn successful at encouraging people to work. Okay, for our final point, let's get into how behavioral economics helps us ask these deeper questions about our own well-being and when it might make sense for policy to step in. We're going to look at this through one of the biggest decisions a family can make, choosing where to live. Just take a second to look at this map. It's really stunning. It shows a child's chance of climbing from the bottom fifth of the income ladder all the way to the top fifth. In those light-colored areas, the odds are much, much better. In the dark red areas, they're much worse. The data is clear. Where you grow up has a huge effect on your future. So the big question is, why don't more families in the red zones just move to the yellow ones, especially when the rent is often about the same? Well, the answer might be in this key behavioral idea, the difference between decision utility and experienced utility. Decision utility is what you think will make you happy, right in the moment you're making a choice. Experienced utility is how you actually feel over the long haul. It's kind of like looking at a dessert menu. Your decision utility screams, get the giant chocolate lava cake. But your experienced utility is that feeling of regret an hour later. The point is, what we choose isn't always what's truly best for us. This chart basically puts that idea into a picture. The red line at the bottom is our choice in the moment, our decision utility. That blue line at the top represents what would actually be best for our long-term well-being, our experienced utility. And that yellow triangle wedged between them, that's what economists call a welfare loss. It's a cost we impose on our future selves. Sometimes it's called an internality. And once you can see this gap, it opens the door for policies, like housing counseling, that can help people make choices that line up better with their own long-term goals. So to wrap this all up, what these examples really show is how behavioral economics gives policymakers a much more powerful and, frankly, a more realistic toolkit. Right? We've seen how it gives us powerful new tools, like using defaults to boost retirement savings. We saw how it leads to better predictions by accounting for things like how knowledge of the tax code actually spreads. And we saw how it helps us ask better questions about well-being, like when we should help families choose a neighborhood that gives their kids a better shot. At the end of the day, this isn't just some abstract academic debate. By getting a real handle on how people actually behave, we can design policies that are just plain smarter, more humane, and a whole lot more effective. Which kind of leaves us with one last big thought. If these tools can help us line up our actions with our own long-term goals, whether it's with saving, working, or choosing a home, what's the next big problem we should point them at?